Now we move to a very important topic, and that is conservation of biodiversity. So when we talk about conservation of biodiversity, we know that various methods are there which help us in conserving biodiversity, and these are the terms I am sure that you are aware of. Something called as in situ conservation and something called as ex situ conservation. We'll have a discussion on that. But before that, we need to understand why do we need to conserve biodiversity. And if you try to answer this, the answer is very similar to what we discussed under impact of the loss of biodiversity. So all the points that were negative in nature while we discussed impact of the loss would probably have to be converted into positive points if you want to show the value of biodiversity. So if you, let's say, are talking about the mains examination, in that case you can say that whether the question is why to conserve biodiversity, or whether it is about the impact of the loss of biodiversity, both will actually have a very similar answer, just that the structure and the tone of your answers will change. Just point out all the things that biodiversity would do, or having a good diversity of species would do, just to list it out. First of all, we know about food. We discussed about our food, and we know that biodiversity has a major role to play in our food. Then we discussed about medicines, whether it is about medicinal plants or certain animals which provide basis for these medicines. Then after that we can talk about fuel. So even fuel is provided by many of the biological sources, especially if you talk about biofuels. So that also comes from biological sources, and having a good biodiversity becomes important from that perspective as well. Then purification and detoxification of air and water, right? So we discussed this point as well. Then comes the point of stabilization and moderation of Earth's climate. Then after that we also discussed about pollination. Then it will help in control of pests and diseases. Then after that there are certain points also. For example, we talked about the cultural significance. So it has cultural significance. We discussed about this. Then after that, the knowledge and educational benefits we can discuss. And also the fact that they are storehouses. They are storehouse of genetic information. And this is the kind of information that can be used in various perspectives. We know that certain combination of genes will produce certain properties in an individual. So if we are able to find out all these, we will be able to make sure that these are being used in some way or the other, and it will be beneficial for us overall. So there are so many things that can be listed out, and all these are the things that we have discussed over the course of this chapter. And that's why, to understand what could be the value of biodiversity and why is it necessary for us to conserve biodiversity, is not very difficult to understand for you at this point of time while the chapter has been done comprehensively. So if we talk about conservation methods, the first method is in situ conservation. So in situ basically would mean at the location or at natural habitat. So if you go by definition, the conservation of species in their natural habitat or natural ecosystem is known as in situ conservation. So when we talk about this, basically your examples will be many of the protected areas. You can talk about the protected areas, for example, the national parks, the wildlife sanctuaries, the biosphere reserves. All these will become the example of protected areas, and that's why they are under in situ conservation, because you are doing the conservation at the site of the given species. So if we look at all the advantages that in situ conservation would have, first of all, it is a cheap and convenient way of conserving biological diversity. It offers a way to preserve large number of organisms simultaneously, which are known or unknown to us. So when you do any kind of in situ conservation, any effort that is being made, for example, we discussed about tigers, that whenever a tiger reserve is being made, it also helps other species to survive in that given location, because that will now be a protected area, a tiger reserve. So all the other organisms also which thrive in that area will also find a suitable habitat for them. Then after that, The existence in natural ecosystems provide opportunity to the living organisms to adjust to differed environmental conditions and evolve into a better life form. So since they are in their natural habitat, since they are in their home, you can say that over a period of time, the gradual changes that happen, the gradual modifications that happen, which help the species to survive for long, which help the species to adapt to the given environment, that is another benefit that you have when you are talking about an in situ conservation. Now, when we talk about the disadvantage that an in situ conservation would have, this is mainly to do with the space. Normally, you will see that whether it's a national park, whether it's a biosphere reserve, a wildlife sanctuary, all these protected areas take up a lot of space. And since you have to provide the natural habitat, it's very logical and very natural that this will happen. But ultimately, just to pinpoint a small disadvantage that we might have in this conservation effort could be the fact that we have to provide a large space, and given the current scenario, given the population explosion, given the concentration of resources, given the pressure on the resources that we have on the earth, this might become a challenge in future. So that's why probably we can say that this is the only negative point about an in situ conservation. Then after that comes the ex situ conservation. So ex situ, obviously the opposite of in situ, where you are taking the species away from the home habitat, creating maybe a very similar ecosystem there, a very similar environment there, so that these species can survive. But it is not happening in the natural habitat of that species. They are being taken away from the ecosystem. So ex situ conservation involves maintenance and breeding of endangered plants and animals under partially or wholly controlled conditions in specific areas like zoo, gardens, that is botanical gardens, etc., nurseries, etc. All these will come under ex situ conservation. Why? Because you have taken the species away from the natural habitat, and that is where you are trying to conserve or save the species. So the conservation of selected plants and animals in selected areas outside their natural habitat is known as ex situ conservation, right? So when you talk about ex situ conservation, seed gene bank can be considered as ex situ, field gene bank can be considered as ex situ, botanical gardens, zoos, all these can be considered as ex situ conservation because they are not being created at the site. And that's why there is a difference between the protected areas like national parks or wildlife sanctuaries as compared to the botanical gardens or zoological gardens or zoos, etc. So there are various strategies that we use for such a conservation that is ex situ in nature. For example, identification of the species that has to be considered, and then there will be an adoption of different ex situ method of conservation depending on what kind of species it is and what scenario is it in currently, what is the current picture in which this species is living, and depending on that there would be a strategy that will be devised for this species. A long-term captive plan and propagation for the species which have lost their habitat permanently. Then short-term propagation and release of the animals in their natural habitat. Animal translocation, animal reintroduction, very very important. You have to remember this because this has been in news a lot of times, especially in the last couple of years. So animal reintroduction plan, whenever we have it, for example, there was one between Gujarat and Madhya Pradesh which did not happen. Then there was, again, we were talking about the reintroduction of cheetah. This was also in news. So all these have been in news. So that's why animal reintroduction becomes very very important topic, and you have to understand that this comes under ex situ conservation. Then advanced technology in the service of endangered species. It could be saving their genetic material, trying to reproduce, trying to clone the species, etc. So these all will become ex situ conservation methods. So anything that is being pushed outside the natural environment will become your ex situ conservation effort. So if we talk about the advantages of ex situ, then first it gives longer lifetime and breeding activity to animals. Genetic techniques can be utilized in the process, which does not happen in situ. Captive breeding species can again be reintroduced in the wild. So first there will be a captive breeding that will happen for the species, and once we know that they are sufficient in number, then after that a gradual slow reintroduction plan is taken, and then they are introduced back into their natural environment. So these are some of the methods. Then again, you can talk about one more advantage, and this could be in terms of space. That normally the space that is taken is negligible, very very small as compared to a national park or a wildlife sanctuary or any other protected area. So space is not going to be a factor which is a disadvantage when it comes to ex situ, because many of the things do not even require a space. For example, if you talk about seed bank, gene bank, these are things which come under ex situ and they don't require any space as such for the species to survive. So that's why these are the kinds of things that can be picked up as an advantage that ex situ has. Then after that, you have to also understand the disadvantage of these methods. So first of all, the favorable conditions may not be maintained always, and this is very very true, becomes very difficult. And you will see that if you go by data and look at the deaths that keep on happening in the zoos, you will understand that many of it is happening because there is no proper maintenance, and of course they are not residing in their natural habitat, so many of times they will not be able to survive. Then after that, new life forms cannot evolve, of course, because there is no genetic breathing space that we are providing to these species. They are being bred in captivity, we are trying to maintain everything, we are monitoring each and every move, and thus we are not providing the natural setting that is required for a greater biodiversity to happen. Then this technique involves only few species. Of course, if you remember, we discussed that when we talk about in situ conservation, many of the knowns and unknown species, they start to get conserved, they start to get a good natural habitat, and they will be able to survive for long, they will be able to thrive for long. But when it comes to the techniques used in ex situ, it is very very specific, and we know which kind of species are being targeted, what are the species that I am after, and how are we carrying out the conservation efforts. So that's why it is something which involves very few species, not all the species. While in case of in situ conservation, we talked about the fact that all the knowns as well as unknowns get conserved there. So that's why this comes as a disadvantage for ex situ conservation. So now with this we come to the end of a very huge segment. This you can say is a bridge between your chapters of the first part, that is ecosystems, and the second part where we start to discuss all the environmental issues like pollution or climate change, etc. So biodiversity, please remember, this is one area from where a lot of topics have come in the examination. In the prelims as well as in the mains examination, there have been multiple questions that have been asked in the past, and this probably remains one of the most important topics that you have here. Now, one more thing, current affairs becomes a huge part of this chapter. Anytime you come across a new species that has been discovered, anytime you come across a new species that is in news, anytime you come across a new report that is coming out, all these kind of things become very very important from this chapter's perspective. Of course, we'll keep on covering all these through our CNAs and the webinars as well, but you need to have a close look at all the topics related to biodiversity, because we have seen that in the past a lot of questions, although have come directly from the concepts that we learned, but in the prelims examination we have seen many direct factual questions that have directly appeared from the newspapers. So for that you need to have this background holistically, and I think we have covered each and every part of what was required to be covered from biodiversity perspective. But here you have to understand that current affairs will also play a big role. So that's why please keep following all the news articles with respect to biodiversity, whether it is being covered in your CNAs or the Hindu analysis or in your webinars. Please ensure that all these you are going through. So this brings me to the end of this particular chapter. If you have any doubts, please let us know. Thank you very much for joining.